Daniel, stop. Please, we can't. The words were a whisper, a useless plea lost in the hot, suffocating air of the boathouse. The scent of damp wood, of gasoline, and the faint, sweet smell of the lake water outside mixed into a dizzying perfume of the forbidden. His hands were firm on her hips, pressing her back against the rough, unfinished wall, and every rational thought in Clara's mind dissolved under his touch. His body was a wall of heat against hers, and she could feel the desperate, frantic beating of his heart, or maybe it was her own. A small, helpless sound escaped her throat as his lips found the sensitive skin of her neck. Oh God, right there. It was a surrender, a quiet, shameful confession of her own desire. This was her sister's husband, and in this secluded, shadowy corner of paradise, he was consuming her whole. This moment felt both like an eternity and a fleeting, stolen second, a terrible, beautiful mistake that had been waiting to happen ever since she arrived. It had only been 3 weeks. 3 weeks since she had driven up the long, winding gravel road, the city's grime and noise fading behind her with every mile. The lake house had appeared through the dense pine trees exactly as she remembered it from pictures. A sprawling masterpiece of cedar and glass, perched on the edge of the crystal-clear water. It was Eleanor's paradise, a testament to the perfect life she had built with her perfect husband, Daniel. Clara had come here seeking refuge, a quiet place to figure out her own, far less perfect life after graduation. Her older sister had welcomed her with open arms, her laughter echoing across the grand deck. And Daniel. He had been the perfect host, the charming, attentive brother-in-law, carrying her bags inside with an easy smile. He had looked at her with such kindness, his eyes the color of a warm summer sky. In those first few days, they were a picture of familial bliss. Eleanor, radiant and commanding, Daniel, handsome and devoted by her side. They were everything Clara hoped to be one day. Then, the urgent call came from Eleanor's firm in the city. A crisis, a project only she could handle. She had to leave for a week, maybe 2. She had kissed Daniel goodbye with a casual intimacy that made Clara's chest ache with a strange mix of envy and admiration, and then she had hugged Clara tightly. "Take care of him for me," she'd whispered, a playful joke that now echoed in Clara's mind with the weight of a solemn broken vow. And just like that, they were alone, the two of them, in a vast, silent house, surrounded by nothing but the whisper of the trees and the endless, shimmering expanse of the lake. The first few days after Eleanor left were filled with a strange and hollow quiet. The house, which had felt so vibrant and full of her sister's bright energy, now seemed vast and echoing. Clara found herself wandering from room to room, touching the expensive furniture, tracing the patterns on the cool granite countertops, feeling like an intruder in a life that was not her own. Daniel seemed to feel it too. He moved through the space with a quiet sort of restlessness, his usual easy smile replaced by a more thoughtful, almost somber expression. He was a perfect gentleman, always ensuring she was comfortable, that she had everything she needed. The first night, he cooked for her, a simple pasta dish with fresh basil from the small herb garden by the kitchen window. Clara sat at the large wooden island, watching him. He moved with an effortless grace, his hands, strong and capable, chopping vegetables with a steady rhythm. The sleeves of his linen shirt were rolled up to his elbows, revealing tanned, muscular forearms, lightly dusted with dark hair. He caught her watching and smiled, a real smile this time, one that made the corners of his eyes crinkle. "Eleanor hates it when I use this much garlic," he said, his voice a low, conspiratorial murmur in the quiet kitchen. "She says she can smell it on me for days." Clara laughed, a small, nervous sound. It felt like sharing a secret, a tiny alliance formed in her sister's absence. The pasta was delicious, and they ate on the deck as the sun bled across the sky in hues of orange and purple, the lake turning into a sheet of dark, shimmering glass. The conversation was light, safe. He asked about her final exams, her plans for the future, her disastrous attempts at finding an apartment in the city. He listened, truly listened, his gaze focused and intent, making her feel as though her trivial anxieties were the most important thing in the world. It was a kind of attention she wasn't used to. The next day, he suggested they take the kayaks out. "It's a crime to be here and not be on the water," he'd said. Clara had been nervous. She was clumsy and inexperienced, but he was an infinitely patient teacher. He helped her into the small craft, his hands resting firmly on her waist to steady her, a touch that was purely functional, yet it sent a jolt of unexpected warmth through her. He showed her how to hold the paddle, his larger hands closing over hers for a moment, demonstrating the proper grip. "Just find a rhythm," he'd instructed, his voice calm and reassuring from his own kayak a few feet away. "Don't fight the water. Work with it." They paddled for over an hour, exploring the silent coves and inlets along the shore. Under the bright afternoon sun, away from the shadows of the house, it almost felt innocent. She watched the easy, powerful way his shoulders moved with each stroke, the play of muscle across his back. He seemed so at home here, so much a part of the wild, natural landscape. It was in the smaller, quieter moments that the shift began. It was nothing overt, nothing she could point to and call improper. It was a collection of tiny, almost imperceptible gestures that began to accumulate in the space between them. One evening, she came downstairs after a shower, her damp hair wrapped in a towel, wearing an old, oversized college t-shirt and shorts. He was on the sofa, reading a book, the lamplight casting a warm glow on his face. He looked up as she entered, and his eyes lingered on her for a fraction of a second too long. "I like your hair like that," he said, his voice soft, all natural. She'd mumbled a thank you, her cheeks flushing as she quickly retreated to the kitchen, her heart thumping foolishly. Another time, he complimented the simple, pale blue sundress she wore. "Eleanor could never wear that color," he'd remarked, looking at her thoughtfully. "It washes her out. But on you, it looks like the sky." The comparison was so poetic, so personal, it left her flustered. He was just being nice, she told herself. He was lonely. He missed his wife and was trying to fill the silence. But then there were the touches, a hand on her shoulder as he leaned over to point out a soaring eagle. His fingers brushing against hers as he passed her a glass of wine on the deck, a contact that seemed to last just a moment longer than necessary. In the narrow hallway leading to the bedrooms, he would pass by, his body close enough for her to feel its warmth, his hand gently, almost absently, grazing the small of her back. Each time it happened, she would freeze, a nervous energy crackling under her skin. She would tell herself it was an accident, a trick of the confined space. But the accidents kept happening. He started to create routines for them. Morning coffee on the dock, watching the mist burn off the lake, afternoon swims to escape the oppressive summer heat. Late-night conversations fueled by wine, where the topics grew steadily more personal. He never spoke ill of Eleanor, not really. But he would sigh and speak of different paths, of dreams that sometimes diverged. He painted a picture of a man who was deeply devoted, but also profoundly alone in his marriage. And he made Clara feel like she was the only one who could see it, the only one who understood. She began to notice things about him she'd never seen before, the way he would rub the back of his neck when he was tired, the faint scar above his right eyebrow, a relic from a childhood accident. She learned the sound of his footsteps on the hardwood floors, the specific scent of his soap mixed with the clean, masculine smell of his skin. He was becoming less of an abstract concept, Eleanor's husband, and more of a man, a tangible, breathing presence who was focusing all of his gentle, magnetic attention solely on her. And Clara, who had come to the lake house feeling lost and invisible, began to bloom under his gaze. She was starting to forget she was just a temporary guest in her sister's life. She was starting to feel like she belonged there, with him, in the quiet, intoxicating intimacy they were building, moment by stolen moment. The air between them grew thick with unspoken things, and the quiet of the big house was no longer empty. It was charged, humming with a dangerous and irresistible energy. The quiet intimacy of their shared evenings began to weave a delicate, invisible web around them. The days settled into a comfortable rhythm, a domesticity that felt both natural and dangerously deceptive. But it was during a particularly hot and humid night that the first real cracks in the facade began to show. A storm was rolling in from the west, the air thick and heavy with the promise of rain. The sky was a bruised purple, and distant, silent flashes of lightning illuminated the dark line of trees across the lake. They had finished dinner, and now they sat in the living room, the lights turned down low, a bottle of deep red wine open between them. The only sounds were the chirping of insects outside and the occasional clink of glass against the wooden coffee table. Daniel seemed pensive, swirling the wine in his glass, his eyes fixed on the turbulent sky outside. He had been quiet all evening, lost in a place Clara couldn't reach. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely louder than a whisper. "She loves this weather," he said, a faint, sad smile on his lips. "Eleanor, she always said it makes the house feel like a ship on a dark sea. Safe, contained." Clara nodded, unsure what to say. The mention of her sister's name felt heavy in the charged air. He took a slow sip of wine, his gaze turning from the window to her. His eyes, in the dim light, looked impossibly deep, and for the first time, she saw a profound weariness in them. "She's an amazing woman, you know," he continued, his voice low and steady, brilliant, driven. "When she wants something, the whole world rearranges itself to make it happen. I've always admired that about her. It's like watching a force of nature." He was praising his wife, her sister, and yet it didn't feel like praise. It felt like the preamble to something else, a carefully constructed foundation for a truth he was about to reveal. Clara waited, her body tense. "But sometimes," he said, and then he paused, letting the word hang in the air. "Sometimes that brilliance, it casts a very long shadow. It's hard to find your own place in the sun when you're standing next to a star." A low rumble of thunder echoed from far away. The confession, when it came, was not a torrent, but a slow, painful leak of long-suppressed feelings. He spoke of loneliness, a strange and specific kind of loneliness that can only exist when you share a bed with someone every night. He talked about feeling like an accessory to her success, the handsome, supportive husband who stood smiling in the background of her photographs. He described attending lavish corporate dinners where he would listen to men praise his wife's mind, her ambition, her ruthlessness, and he would feel a growing sense of invisibility. He wasn't complaining, he insisted. He was just thinking aloud. Clara listened, mesmerized. This was a version of their perfect marriage she had never imagined. This was a Daniel she didn't know, a man filled with doubt and a quiet, aching vulnerability. Her initial instinct was to defend Eleanor, to say that her sister loved him, that her career was for both of them. But the words caught in her throat. The sadness in his voice felt too raw, too genuine to be dismissed. As he spoke, her perception of him sharpened, became intensely focused. She noticed the way the soft lamplight caught the silver strands at his temples, evidence of a stress she had never considered. She watched his hands, the same strong hands that had guided her kayak, now gesturing with a sort of helpless frustration. He was wearing a simple gray t-shirt that stretched across the solid width of his shoulders and chest, a physique that spoke of disciplined, solitary morning runs along the lake. But now, that strength seemed like a carefully constructed armor, and he was letting her see the chinks in it. "I don't know why I'm telling you this, Clara," he said, finally looking directly at her. His gaze was so intense it felt like a physical touch. "I've never said any of this out loud before. Not to anyone." The words struck her with incredible force. Not to anyone, not even his wife, not his best friend, just her. In that moment, she felt a powerful, heady rush. It was more than just sympathy. It was a feeling of being chosen, of being entrusted with a sacred confidence. A secret world had been opened up to her, a world that consisted only of the two of them, huddled together in the warm, dim light, with the storm gathering outside. She felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to reach across the table, to place her hand on his, to offer some kind of comfort. She resisted, her fingers curling tightly around the stem of her wine glass instead. "I'm a good listener," she managed to say, her voice sounding thin and unfamiliar to her own ears. He gave her a grateful, weary smile. "You are," he said softly. "When I'm with you, the house doesn't feel so big. The quiet isn't empty." The storm broke then. The first heavy drops of rain began to pelt against the large glass windows, and a brilliant fork of lightning was followed by an immediate, deafening crack of thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. Clara jumped, and Daniel's hand instinctively shot across the table, covering hers. "It's okay," he said, his voice a low vibration. She felt all the way up her arm. "We're safe in here." His touch was electric. His thumb gently stroked the back of her hand, a gesture of comfort that felt devastatingly intimate. The warmth of his skin seemed to seep directly into her bones. The storm raged outside, but inside, a different kind of tempest was brewing in the charged silence. He didn't move his hand, and she didn't pull away. They just sat there for a long moment, his hand covering hers, the unspoken confession hanging between them, more powerful than any declaration. He had invited her into his loneliness, and in doing so, had created a bond that was secret, thrilling, and profoundly treacherous. When she finally went to bed that night, the sound of the rain lashing against her window was a lonely counterpoint to the wild, chaotic storm inside her own heart. She felt guilty, a deep, sickening wave of disloyalty to her sister. But beneath the guilt, a dangerous new feeling was taking root. She felt special, she felt seen, and she wanted more. The day after the storm was a watercolor painting of gray and green. A persistent, soft rain fell, blurring the edges of the world, turning the lake into a vast, misty expanse, and trapping them within the warm, wooden confines of the house. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth and pine. It was a day made for indoor pursuits, for old books and quiet contemplation. By early afternoon, a kind of listless boredom had settled over them, and Daniel suggested a movie. He browsed through a collection of classics, his fingers tracing the spines of the cases. "How about this one?" he asked, holding up an old black and white romance. "It was my mother's favorite." Clara agreed, grateful for the distraction, for something to fill the charged silence that had lingered between them since his confession the night before. They settled onto the enormous plush sofa, a soft cashmere blanket draped over their laps. The film began, its dramatic orchestral score filling the room, the actor's voices a crisp, old-fashioned cadence. For a while, it worked. The story on the screen was engrossing enough to provide a neutral territory, a safe place for them to exist together without the weight of their new, secret understanding. Clara found herself relaxing, sinking into the soft cushions, the rhythmic patter of the rain against the windows a soothing backdrop. She was acutely aware of him beside her, of the sheer space he occupied. He sat with one arm stretched along the back of the sofa, his posture relaxed, his scent a clean, subtle mix of soap, and something uniquely him drifting faintly towards her. An hour into the film, during a particularly poignant scene, Clara felt a slight shift. His hand, which had been resting on the back of the sofa, moved. She felt it before she saw it, a faint, stirring in her peripheral vision. Then she felt a gentle weight settle on her thigh. It was a light, almost hesitant touch, his palm resting just above her knee on the soft fabric of her leggings. The touch was electric. A bolt of pure, unadulterated shock shot through her entire body, making her go completely rigid. Her breath caught in her throat, and her heart gave a painful, violent lurch against her ribs. Every muscle screamed at her to flinch, to pull away, to create a space that he had just so brazenly erased. The movie, the rain, the entire world outside of that single point of contact dissolved into an irrelevant, muffled hum. There was only the heat of his hand, a searing brand that seemed to burn right through the fabric and scorch her skin. She could feel the distinct shape of his fingers, the slight roughness of a callus on his palm. It was an anchor in a swirling sea of panic and a terrifying, illicit thrill. A war erupted inside her. A voice, clear and cold and sounding exactly like her sister, screamed, "What are you doing? Move! Say something! This is Daniel. This is Eleanor's husband." But another voice, a dark, seductive whisper she had never heard before, urged her to be still. What if it's an accident? It reasoned. He's just getting comfortable. If you make a scene, it will be awkward. It will ruin everything. But she knew it wasn't an accident. The weight of his hand was too deliberate, too certain. And as the seconds stretched into an eternity, his hand remained, a silent, unwavering claim. Her inaction felt like a betrayal as profound as any kiss. By not moving, she was giving her consent. By staying silent, she was screaming yes. Her skin tingled, and a slow liquid heat began to spread through her veins, starting from that single, forbidden point of contact and moving outward, a shameful, undeniable response. He must have felt her tense, must have known the turmoil he had ignited within her, but he didn't move his hand. Instead, he broke the spell not with an apology or a retreat, but with his voice, soft and laced with a strange, manufactured nostalgia. "This scene reminds me of the first time I met Eleanor," he said, his tone conversational, almost wistful. The sound of her sister's name was a physical blow. Clara's eyes, which had been staring blankly at the screen, flickered towards him. He wasn't watching the movie. He was watching her. His gaze was steady, intense, a silent interrogation. He continued to speak, his voice a low murmur, but his eyes never left hers. She was wearing a red dress. You know the one. She commanded the entire room, so confident, so beautiful. I was terrified to even talk to her. He was painting a picture of his wife, the woman he had sworn to love and cherish, while his hand rested possessively on her sister's thigh. The cognitive dissonance was dizzying. It was a calculated, cruel, and unbelievably seductive act. He was testing her, pulling her deeper into his betrayal, forcing her to be a complicit audience to a story that should have pushed her away, but instead only seemed to bind her closer to him. Her own history, with her sister, a lifetime of shared memories, of love and loyalty, felt thin and fragile against the raw, palpable reality of his touch. The movie played on, the actors on the screen falling in love, their black and white world so much simpler than the complex, dangerous technicolor of emotions exploding inside of her. The rain fell, washing the world clean, while Clara felt irrevocably stained. His hand was still there, a warm, heavy promise, and she still hadn't moved. She couldn't. The boundary had been crossed, not with a passionate, impulsive kiss, but with a quiet, deliberate touch in the gray light of a rainy afternoon. And in her silence, in her stillness, she knew she had just consented to the fall. The hours after the movie were a study in exquisite torture. The air in the house grew so thick with unspoken tension that Clara felt she might suffocate. They moved around each other like ghosts, occupying the same space but never truly connecting. Every word was stilted. Every glance was either held too long or cut short too quickly. They ate a dinner of leftovers in near silence, the clinking of their forks against the plates, sounding like gunshots in the quiet dining room. The memory of his hand on her leg was a physical presence, a third person sitting at the table with them. Clara was desperate for the day to end, desperate to escape to the solitude of her room where she could try to make sense of the chaos in her mind. But when she finally said goodnight, her voice a strained whisper, and climbed the stairs, she found no peace. Sleep was an impossibility. Her mind was a racetrack, replaying the moment on the sofa, over and over. She could still feel the phantom weight of his hand, the burning heat of his gaze. She tossed and turned in the unfamiliar bed, the expensive cotton sheets feeling like sandpaper against her feverish skin. Guilt was a cold, heavy stone in her stomach. She saw her sister's smiling, trusting face every time she closed her eyes. Eleanor, who had given her a key to this paradise, who had told her to take care of him. And all the while, a treacherous current of excitement, a dark and thrilling hum, coursed through her veins. She was ashamed of it, terrified of it, but it was undeniably there. She was alive with a kind of dangerous energy she had never experienced before. After what felt like hours, a raging thirst drove her from the bed. Her throat was dry, her lips parched. She slipped out of her room, clad only in a thin, worn-out t-shirt and a pair of soft cotton shorts, and crept down the stairs, her bare feet silent on the cool hardwood. The house was bathed in the ethereal silver light of the moon, which poured through the massive windows, casting long, eerie shadows across the furniture. She made her way to the kitchen, a cavern of darkness and silver, and then she saw him. He was standing by the glass doors that led to the deck, a dark silhouette against the moonlit lake, holding a glass. He was perfectly still, like a statue, and she had the sudden, chilling thought that he had been waiting for her. He turned his head slowly as she entered, and though his face was in shadow, she could feel the intensity of his gaze. There was no pretense left between them, no safe role of brother-in-law to hide behind. The look in his eyes, even from across the room, was one of raw, undisguised hunger. It was the look of a man who had made a decision, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Her feet felt rooted to the floor. She should have turned, run back up the stairs, and locked her door. She should have screamed, but she did nothing. She just stood there, caught in the tractor beam of his stare, her breathing shallow. He placed his glass down on the counter with a soft, deliberate click, and then he began to move towards her. He didn't rush. He walked slowly, closing the distance between them with a predatory grace that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. Each step he took was a countdown to the inevitable. With every footfall, her resolve crumbled a little more. The cavernous kitchen seemed to shrink until it was only the few feet of charged space that separated their bodies. When he finally stood before her, he was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. She had to tilt her head back to look up at him, a position of complete and utter vulnerability. He smelled of wine and the clean, masculine scent of the night. He raised his hand not to touch her body, but to gently cup her jaw, his thumb stroking the soft skin beneath her ear. His touch was feather-light, yet it sent a tremor through her entire frame. "Clara," he breathed, his voice a low, rough whisper that was for her and her alone. He leaned in closer, his lips just inches from hers. "Tell me to stop." It was a challenge, a final, desperate offering of an escape she no longer wanted. He was giving her the power, the responsibility. The word was right there, on the tip of her tongue. Stop. A single, simple word that would save her, that would preserve the last shred of her loyalty, her innocence. But it wouldn't come. She couldn't speak. She could only stare into his dark, dilated pupils and drown. A tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head was her only answer. It was all the permission he needed. He closed the remaining distance and his lips met hers. The first touch was surprisingly soft, a moment of gentle, questioning pressure. It was a reconnaissance, a final confirmation. And when she didn't pull away, when her own lips softened and parted in a silent, involuntary invitation, the nature of the kiss changed. It deepened, becoming hungry, demanding, a raw and desperate release of all the tension that had been building between them for days. His other hand came up to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair, holding her fast. It was a kiss that tasted of dark wine and darker secrets. The slight roughness of his stubble was an abrasive pleasure against her skin. Her hands, which had been hanging uselessly at her sides, came up to press weakly against the hard wall of his chest in a final, futile gesture of resistance. But there was no strength in them. The fight was over. Reason had been silenced, drowned out by the roaring in her ears. A small, defeated sigh escaped her, and her body went limp against his, surrendering completely. Her hands slid from his chest up to his shoulders, her fingers clinging to him as the world tilted on its axis. He had breached her final defense, and in the moonlit silence of her sister's kitchen, Clara knew she was utterly and irrevocably lost. The kiss was a lit fuse, burning its way down a line of gunpowder that had been laid, day by day, since her arrival. It was no longer gentle or questioning. It was a frantic, desperate collision. A lifetime of unspoken rules and sacred boundaries evaporated in the heat between their mouths. His hands, no longer content with just her face and hair, slid down her back, pressing her body flush against his, letting her feel the hard, undeniable proof of his desire. He broke the kiss only to trail a fiery path of new ones down her jaw, her throat, to the hollow at the base of her neck where her pulse beat like a trapped bird. A helpless moan escaped her lips, the first sound she had made, a sound of pure, unthinking surrender. It was the only encouragement he needed. In one fluid, powerful movement, he hooked an arm beneath her knees and lifted her off the floor. She gasped, her arms instinctively tightening around his neck, her world tilting as he carried her the few steps to the large granite island in the center of the kitchen. He sat her on the edge, the stone surface shockingly cold against the bare skin of her thighs. The position was one of complete vulnerability, of offering. She was elevated, exposed in the pale moonlight, the queen of a dark and illicit chessboard. He stood between her knees, trapping her, his body a warm, solid wall. He looked at her, his breathing heavy and ragged, his eyes glowing with an intensity that stripped her bare. "Clara," he rasped, his voice thick with a need that had clearly been suppressed for a very long time. With unsteady hands, he took the hem of her thin t-shirt and slowly began to pull it upwards. She held her breath, her own hands frozen in her lap as he drew the fabric up and over her head, plunging her into a moment of darkness before revealing her to the cool night air and his devouring gaze. She shivered, though the kitchen wasn't cold. It was the feeling of being utterly seen, of her most protected self being laid bare. Now, she was clad only in a simple bra and her panties. They were white, made of a soft, delicate lace, a detail of innocence that seemed almost profane in the context of what was happening. His gaze dropped, and his eyes locked onto them. He didn't speak. He just looked, his expression a mixture of reverence and a kind of fierce, possessive hunger. He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the lace edge where it rested on her hip. The touch was light as a whisper, but it sent a cascade of fire through her veins. It was at that moment, as his fingers began to hook under the delicate fabric, that the last vestiges of her conscience screamed. A single, panicked thought of her sister, laughing and happy in this very kitchen, tore through the fog of her desire. "Daniel," she breathed, the words weak, desperate. "Your wife, my sister." It was a pathetic protest, a final, futile appeal to a morality they had already abandoned. He paused, his fingers still hooked in her underwear, and looked up at her face. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the terror, the guilt. He leaned forward and silenced her with another kiss, this one deeper, slower, a kiss that was not about passion but about persuasion, about erasing that last shred of doubt. "She's not here, Clara," he whispered against her lips, the words of venomous, seductive logic. "It's just us." And with that, he pulled the last of her defenses away. The act itself was a blur of overwhelming sensations. The cold, unyielding granite beneath her back, the powerful rhythmic heat of his body joined with hers, the patterns of moonlight shifting across his tense shoulders. She squeezed her eyes shut, a desperate attempt to block out the world, to block out the image of Eleanor's portrait that hung in the hallway, her smiling eyes seeming to watch, to judge. This was a betrayal so profound it felt like a kind of death, the death of the person she used to be, the good daughter, the loyal sister. But then, the pleasure began to build. It started as a low, deep thrumming and grew steadily, a relentless rising tide. It was an astonishing, terrifying force, a physical truth that was more powerful than any moral argument. It consumed her guilt, smothered her fear, and demanded her full attention. In that moment, she made a conscious choice. She chose to let go. She chose the sensation. She let the tide pull her under, her fingers digging into the hard muscle of his arms, her back arching against the cold stone as waves of forbidden ecstasy crashed over her. The sounds that escaped her lips were no longer her own. They were the primal, involuntary cries of a body pushed to the very edge of feeling. And in that blinding, shattering release, there was no thought of her sister, no room for guilt, no space for anything at all except the all-consuming, world-ending pleasure that Daniel's body was giving her. The silence that flooded the kitchen in the aftermath was more profound, more damning than any accusation. The world, which had contracted to the single, explosive point of their union, slowly and cruelly expanded again, letting in the reality of what they had done. Clara felt the cold of the granite seeping into her bones, a deep, invasive chill that the fading heat of their passion could not warm. Daniel moved first. He gently eased away from her, and the sudden absence of his body left her feeling hollowed out, terrifyingly exposed in the pale moonlight. He didn't look at her, not at first. He simply reached for her discarded t-shirt and held it out to her, a gesture of practicality that felt almost surreal after the primal intimacy they had just shared. She took it with trembling fingers, her eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet his gaze. Without a word, she slid off the counter, her legs unsteady, and pulled the shirt over her head. It felt like a flimsy shield, useless against the weight of his stare and the enormity of her own shame. He was the one who broke the silence, his voice a low, rough thing. "Go to bed, Clara." It wasn't a command, not exactly, but it was not a suggestion either. It was a dismissal. She fled, not even daring to look back, and hurried up the stairs to her room, the scene of their crime burning behind her. Alone in her room, the full weight of her betrayal crashed down on her. There was no escape from it. She stood under the spray of a scalding hot shower for nearly an hour, scrubbing at her skin as if she could wash away his touch, his scent, the memory of her own surrender. But it was useless. His phantom touch lingered everywhere, and the scent of him seemed to have permeated her own skin. She wrapped herself in a towel and stared at her reflection in the steamed-up mirror. The girl looking back at her was a stranger, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and a dark, unfamiliar glow. Her lips looked bruised, swollen. This was the face of an adulteress, the face of a sister who had stolen something precious and irreplaceable from the one person she should have protected above all others. Sleep did not come. She lay awake, staring into the darkness, as the pleasure of the memory warred with the acid of her guilt. The things his body had made her feel were undeniable, a truth she could not rationalize away. And the most terrifying part was the small, treacherous voice that whispered, in the deepest, most honest part of her soul, that she would do it all over again. The morning arrived with a brutal, cheerful brightness. Sunlight streamed into her room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, seemingly mocking the darkness that had consumed her night. She stayed in bed as long as she could, dreading the inevitable moment when she would have to leave the relative safety of her room and face him. When she finally forced herself downstairs, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs, she found him in the kitchen. He was at the stove, calmly scrambling eggs, a mug of coffee steaming beside him. He was dressed in shorts and a fresh t-shirt, his hair still damp from a morning swim. He looked rested, invigorated, completely untroubled. The sheer, maddening normality of it sent a jolt of angry confusion through her. For her, the kitchen was a haunted space, a crime scene. She couldn't look at the granite island without a hot flush of shame creeping up her neck. For him, it was just the kitchen. "Morning," he said, his voice even and friendly as if nothing had happened. "Coffee's fresh. I made eggs." She could only manage a choked, strangled sound in response. She poured herself a coffee with a shaking hand, her back turned to him, willing herself not to shatter into a million pieces. They ate breakfast on the deck, the silence between them, a living entity pulsing with unspoken words. Clara could barely swallow, each bite of the perfectly cooked eggs tasting like ash in her mouth. She kept her eyes fixed on the shimmering surface of the lake, on a distant boat, on anything but the man sitting across from her. He, on the other hand, ate with a healthy appetite, seemingly at ease. But she could feel his eyes on her, a steady, patient gaze that was stripping away her defenses layer by layer. The tension finally became unbearable. After clearing the plates and standing awkwardly by the sink, he was the one to break it. He came to stand beside her, leaning his hip against the counter, so close she could feel the warmth of his body. She stared into the soapy water in the sink, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge. "Clara," he said, his voice soft, forcing her to look at him. His expression was serious, his blue eyes clear and direct. He held her gaze for a long moment before he spoke again. "Last night," he began, and her stomach plummeted. "Last night was a mistake." The word hung in the air, a small, inadequate acknowledgement of the chasm they had opened up in their lives. She felt a bizarre wave of relief. He had said it. He had named the sin. It was a mistake. They could pretend it never happened. They could go back. But then he continued, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a conspiratorial whisper meant only for her, but a beautiful one. And there it was. Not an apology, not a regret. It was a reframing. A reclassification of their shared transgression from something ugly and shameful into something precious and beautiful. The word mistake was merely a concession, a token offering to her guilt. The word beautiful was the truth. It was the confirmation. It was a promise. It was an invitation. Clara had no response. The words simply did not exist. What could she possibly say? No, it was just a horrible mistake. Her body's ecstatic response to him would make that a lie. Yes, it was beautiful. That would make her a monster. So she remained silent, her gaze locked with his. And in that shared, silent moment, the new terms of their relationship were forged. Her silence was her answer. It was her agreement. The unbearable tension of the morning did not disappear, but it transformed. It was no longer the awkward, guilty tension of two people trying to ignore a terrible secret. It was the electrifying, conspiratorial tension of two people who had just agreed to keep it, to nurture it. He had not apologized. He had canonized their sin. And she, with her silence, had just knelt at the altar. The days that followed their unspoken agreement were a strange symphony of heightened sensation. The oppressive, awkward silence was replaced by a low, constant hum of shared awareness. There was no need for confessions or whispered plans. The affair lived in the air between them, in the charged space they now occupied. It was in the way his hand would brush against hers as they both reached for the coffee pot in the morning, a touch that lasted a second too long, sending a jolt of illicit electricity through her. It was in the long, smoldering looks they exchanged across the dinner table, secret conversations held in plain sight. It was in the way he would watch her as she read on the deck, his gaze so intense she could feel it on her skin like the summer sun, warming her, branding her. The guilt was still there, a constant, dull ache in Clara's chest, but it was now interwoven with a thrilling, terrifying sense of complicity. They were partners in this, bound by a secret that was both beautiful and monstrous. The desire, now acknowledged and legitimized in their silent pact, did not abate. Instead, it festered under the humid summer heat, growing more potent, more demanding with each passing day of forced restraint. It was a hunger that stolen glances and fleeting touches could no longer satisfy. The breaking point came on a sweltering afternoon 4 days later. The air was thick as honey, and the sun beat down relentlessly, bleaching the color from the sky. Clara had spent most of the day by the water's edge, clad only in a simple black bikini, trying to lose herself in a novel, but the words blurred on the page. Her body felt restless, her skin overly sensitive, every nerve ending alive and waiting. Daniel found her there, emerging from the house shirtless, wearing only a pair of faded board shorts. Sweat glistened on his tanned shoulders and chest. He looked like a pagan god of the sun and water. "One of the kayak paddles is cracked," he announced, his voice casual, but his eyes told a different story. They weren't looking at her face. They were tracing the line of her body, from her damp hair down to her bare feet. "I'm going down to the boathouse to see if there's a spare. Want to help?" It wasn't a question, it was a summons. "Okay," she said, her voice sounding breathless. She pulled a thin white linen shirt over her bikini, the fabric doing little to conceal her form, and followed him down the worn path. The boathouse was a dim, cool cavern after the blinding Sunday. It smelled of its history. Damp, aging wood, the faint, sharp tang of gasoline, stagnant lake water, and dust. Light filtered in through a single grimy window, illuminating swirling particles in the air. It felt completely cut off from the main house, a separate world with its own set of rules. Daniel went directly to a rack of old boating equipment, pulling down a wooden paddle and inspecting it. "Here's the one," he said, pointing to a hairline fracture in the wood. Clara moved closer, ostensibly to look, bending slightly to get a better view. She was intensely aware of him standing just behind her, of the heat radiating from his body. She could feel his gaze on her, a hot, focused weight on the curve of her hips and the roundness of her backside, barely concealed by the thin black fabric of her bikini bottoms. A shiver, completely unrelated to the temperature, traced its way up her spine. This was a pretext. They both knew it. The paddle was an excuse. The air grew thick, heavy with anticipation. He didn't say a word. He simply reached out and placed a hand on her hip, his touch firm and possessive. He turned her slowly, deliberately, until she was facing him. He backed her against a rough, unfinished wooden wall, caging her in with his body. This time, there was no hesitation, no questioning kiss. His mouth crashed down on hers, hungry and bruising, a kiss that was not about seduction but about claiming. It was a raw, desperate expression of the need that had been tormenting them for days. Her flimsy cover-up was an immediate casualty, his hands pushing it from her shoulders until it pooled around her elbows, trapping her arms. He broke the kiss to press his mouth against her throat, his teeth grazing her skin, and she tilted her head back, a silent, instinctive offering. His hands were everywhere, untying the strings of her bikini top with practiced ease, his palms cupping her bare breasts, his thumbs stroking her nipples into hard peaks. This was the scene from her memory, from the beginning of her story, but now it was real, immediate, and overwhelming. She felt the rough planks of the wall against her bare back, the solid, muscular heat of his half-naked body pressing into hers. Her hands, finally free of the shirt, tangled in his thick hair, pulling him closer, her nails scraping lightly against his scalp. "Daniel," she gasped when his lips returned to hers. But it was not a protest. It was a prayer. He worked at the tie of her bikini bottoms, his fingers fumbling in his haste. The last piece of fabric fell away, leaving her completely naked before him. He pulled back for a moment to look at her, his eyes dark with a desire so potent it seemed to strip away her very soul, and then he shed his own shorts with a single, fluid motion. The world contracted to this dim, dusty space, to the symphony of their ragged breaths and the frantic beating of their hearts. His hands gripped her hips, lifting her slightly, pressing her harder against the wall as he entered her. It was a fierce, almost violent joining, a collision of pure, unadulterated need. There was no tenderness, no pretense of romance. This was raw, this was carnal, this was a desperate act of mutual consumption. "Oh, Daniel," she cried out, the sound swallowed by the thick, humid air. "Harder, please." It was a plea, a demand, a complete abdication of control. She wrapped her legs around his waist, meeting his every thrust with a desperate energy of her own, chasing a release that felt like the only possible salvation. He whispered her name against her ear, over and over, a mantra, the only word that existed in their universe. The climax was a violent, shattering wave, a shared explosion that left them both trembling, gasping, their sweat-slicked bodies clinging to each other in the dim, dusty light of the boathouse. For a few blissful, thought-free seconds, there was only the aftermath, the feeling of him inside her, the sound of the lake water lapping gently, ceaselessly, against the wooden pilings just outside the wall. For a long, suspended moment after the world fell away, there was only the sound of their breathing, harsh and ragged in the thick, humid air of the boathouse. Clara's body, slick with sweat, was still pressed against his, her legs still loosely wrapped around his waist. The rough, splintery texture of the wooden wall was a grounding reality against her bare back. The frantic, desperate energy had ebbed away, leaving a heavy, languid peace in its wake. She rested her forehead against his shoulder, her eyes closed, listening to the frantic thrum of his heart, gradually slowing to a steady, powerful beat. The scent of him, mixed with the damp, earthy smell of the boathouse and the undeniable, metallic scent of their sex, filled her senses. In this dim, hidden corner of the world, it was easy to believe that they were the only two people who existed, that the rules of the life outside these walls did not apply. It was a fragile, perfect, and utterly delusional peace, and then it was shattered. The sound was alien here, a sharp, digital, and impossibly loud chirping that sliced through the organic quiet. It was a sound from the other world, the real world. It came from the pile of discarded clothes on the dusty floor. Daniel froze, every muscle in his body going rigid. Clara's eyes flew open. They both looked down at the source of the noise, his shorts, vibrating faintly on the floorboards. The screen was lit up, casting a cold, blue glow in the dimness, and on it, a single, catastrophic word, accompanied by a bright, smiling picture of her sister. Eleanor. Reality did not crash in like a wave. It detonated like a bomb. The fragile peace, the illicit intimacy, the sensual haze, it all vaporized in an instant of pure, cold-dreaded panic. They sprang apart as if they'd been burned, a clumsy, shameful uncoupling. Suddenly, Clara was hyper-aware of her own nakedness, of the stickiness on her thighs, of her disheveled hair. The man in front of her was no longer her passionate, secret lover. He was her sister's husband, caught in the act. The phone continued its insistent, cheerful ringing, a relentless countdown to discovery. "Shit," Daniel hissed, the word of violent exhalation. What followed was a frantic, pathetic scramble. It was a silent ballet of shame, their movements clumsy and uncoordinated. Clara fumbled for her bikini bottoms, her fingers trembling so badly she could barely tie the strings. She found her top and pulled it on, not caring that it was inside out. Daniel yanked on his shorts, his face a mask of grim concentration. They avoided each other's eyes, the shared glance of a moment ago, now an impossibility, a source of unbearable shame. He snatched the phone from the floor just as it was about to go to voicemail, his thumb hovering over the screen. He took one deep, steadying breath, ran a hand through his sweat-dampened hair, and completely transformed. The panicked, guilty lover vanished, and in his place stood the calm, untroubled husband. He turned his back to her, a gesture that felt like a physical wall being erected between them, and answered the call. "Hey, you," he said, his voice a masterpiece of casual affection. It was so normal, so smooth, it made the bile rise in Clara's throat. She retreated further into the shadows, pressing herself into a dark corner behind a stack of old life preservers, as if the darkness could swallow her whole. She was an unwilling voyeur, a hidden witness to the performance of the life she was helping to destroy. "No, everything's great here," he said, a light chuckle in his voice. "Just down at the boathouse, actually. One of the kayak paddles split, so I was looking for a replacement. Just tinkering around." He was a phenomenal liar, effortless. The lie was so specific, so mundane, it had to be true. He listened for a moment, his posture relaxed, leaning against a support beam. "Oh, that's fantastic news. I knew you'd get it done. You always do." His voice was filled with a convincing, husbandly pride. Clara felt her stomach clench. Every word of praise for her sister was a hot poker against her own conscience. He was talking to Eleanor about her triumphs, her successes, while the evidence of his betrayal was still cooling on Clara's skin. The conversation continued, a stream of domestic intimacies and shared plans. He asked about Eleanor's flight, confirmed their dinner plans for her return, laughed at a joke she made. He was building their future while simultaneously demolishing Clara's present. She stood frozen in her corner, feeling dirty and small, a sordid little secret hidden in the dark. She looked down at her own body, at the wrinkled linen shirt she'd pulled on, at her bare, dusty feet on the grimy floor. The intoxicating thrill of their encounter had curdled into a thick, choking self-loathing. The climax of the call was the final, twisting knife. His voice softened, became tender, intimate. "Okay, you travel safe," he said. A pause. "Of course. I miss you too." And then, the three words that broke what was left of her heart. "Love you." He said it so easily. The same three words he had probably said to his wife thousands of times. They were a sacred vow, a sacred truth in their marriage. And he had said them just after being inside her, his body still marked with her scent. The hypocrisy was so vast, so profound, it left her breathless. He ended the call, and a heavy, suffocating silence descended on the boathouse once more. For a long moment, he didn't turn around. Then, he let out a long, slow breath and finally faced her. The mask was gone. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. The lie he had just told so brilliantly now hung in the air between them, a toxic, shimmering fog. The thrill was gone. The passion was a distant, shameful memory. All that was left was the cold, ugly, and undeniable truth of their deception. If the days leading up to the phone call were a fever dream of escalating desire, the days that followed were a cold, sober hell. The boathouse encounter had been a point of no return, but the sound of Eleanor's voice over the phone had been the moment the bill for their sins came due. The affair was no longer a secret, stolen world of pleasure for Clara. It was a harsh, ugly reality that now colored every waking moment. The beautiful lake house, once a symbol of idyllic escape, transformed into a luxurious prison. Its large windows no longer offered breathtaking views of the water, but instead felt like the unblinking eyes of a world that was judging her. The silence, once a peaceful blanket, was now a suffocating void, amplifying the sound of her own frantic, guilty thoughts. Eleanor was everywhere. Her ghost haunted every room, a smiling, spectral presence that silently condemned her sister. Clara would see her in the framed photograph on the mantelpiece, the two of them, Daniel and Eleanor, beaming on their wedding day. Daniel's arm was wrapped possessively around his wife, his smile so full of genuine love that it made Clara physically sick to look at. She saw her in the scent of her expensive perfume that lingered in the master bathroom, in the neat stack of novels on her bedside table, in a half-finished crossword puzzle left on the kitchen counter. Each object was a testament to a life, a love, a trust that Clara had willfully, selfishly desecrated. The guilt was a physical entity. It lived in the pit of her stomach, a constant, nauseating knot that stole her appetite. Food tasted like cardboard. She began to lose weight, and dark, bruised circles appeared beneath her eyes. Sleep offered no escape, as her nights were plagued by anxious dreams where Eleanor would confront her, her expression not angry but filled with a deep, soul-crushing disappointment. She would wake up with her heart pounding, the sheets damp with a cold sweat. She took to taking long, scalding showers, as if the heat could somehow purify her, but she always felt unclean. The most bewildering and terrifying part of this new reality was Daniel. While Clara was visibly disintegrating, he seemed utterly untroubled. The moment of panic in the boathouse had been fleeting, an anomaly. He had compartmentalized his transgression with a chilling efficiency that she found both fascinating and monstrous. He swam in the lake every morning, worked on his laptop for a few hours in the afternoon, and grilled steaks for dinner as if nothing had changed. The guilt that was consuming her seemed to have no hold on him at all. His desire for her, however, had not vanished. It had merely mutated. The tentative, seductive courtship was gone, replaced by a cool, confident sense of ownership. He had possessed her, and now he seemed to believe he had a right to her. His touches were no longer questioning. They were presumptive. He would corner her in the hallway, pressing a kiss to her neck, his hand sliding down her back with an assured familiarity that made her skin crawl. He would walk up behind her while she was washing dishes and whisper in her ear, "I couldn't sleep last night. I was thinking about you," his voice low and suggestive, a threat disguised as a compliment. He seemed to enjoy her fear, her discomfort. It was a new, cruel element in their dynamic, a way of reminding her of her complicity, of the power he now wielded over her. She began to see the vulnerability he had shown her that first stormy night, not as a genuine confession, but as a calculated predatory tactic. He had sniffed out her loneliness, her naivety, and had expertly exploited it. Clara tried to escape him. She would barricade herself in her room with a book, but she couldn't concentrate, her eyes scanning the same page over and over. She would take long, aimless walks along the wooded shoreline, seeking a solitude that was constantly shattered by the knowledge that she would eventually have to return to the house, to him. The forced proximity of meals was the worst. They would sit at either end of the long dining table, the empty chairs between them, a testament to the family they were betraying. The silence would stretch, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the scrape of cutlery on porcelain. In these silences, her desire and her disgust would wage a silent, bloody war within her. She loathed him for his casual cruelty, for his lack of conscience. She loathed herself for her weakness. And yet when his eyes would catch hers across the table, a dark, knowing look passing between them, her body would still betray her with a shameful, involuntary shiver of response. One evening, she was curled up on a window seat in the library, a room at the far end of the house she had adopted as a sanctuary, pretending to read as the sun set. She heard his footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming down the hall. She tensed, her knuckles white on the edge of her book. He appeared in the doorway, not entering, just leaning against the frame, watching her. "You're good at hiding," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. It was a simple statement of fact. "I'm just reading," she mumbled, not looking up from the page. "No, you're not," he said, his voice dropping lower. "You're hiding. You've been hiding for days." He pushed himself off the door frame and walked slowly into the room. He stopped in front of her, so close that his legs were almost touching her knees. He reached down and took the book from her hands, placing it aside. Then he cupped her face, forcing her to look at him. His eyes were cold, possessive. "You can't hide from me in my own house, Clara," he said softly, his thumb stroking her cheek in a gesture that was meant to be comforting but felt like a brand. "There's nowhere for you to go." In that moment, she understood the true nature of her situation. She wasn't a participant in a passionate, albeit forbidden affair. She was a captive, trapped in a beautiful prison with a man who was not her lover, but her warden. And the most terrifying part was that she knew with a sickening certainty that he had not yet finished with her. The knowledge that she was leaving acted as a strange and sobering anesthetic. Clara spent the day in a numb, methodical haze, moving through the motions of packing. She folded her clothes with a detached precision, placing them back into the suitcase she had arrived with a lifetime ago. Each item, the pale blue sundress he'd complimented, The thin t-shirt she'd worn that first night in the kitchen, the black bikini from the boathouse was an artifact from a ruin, a piece of evidence from her own self-destruction. Eleanor was due back in 2 days. The thought of the three of them under this roof, playing their parts in a grotesque parody of a happy family, was a prospect so horrifying it gave her the final, desperate surge of strength she needed to escape. She had a bus ticket booked on her phone, a single, one-way ticket to a city where no one knew her name, leaving at dawn. She would be gone before he even woke up. As dusk settled, painting the lake in somber shades of gray and lavender, a new and unexpected feeling began to creep in. It wasn't desire, and it wasn't just fear. It was a profound, aching sense of incompletion. She couldn't just vanish into the night. An act of such magnitude, a betrayal that had reshaped her entire being, could not simply be left to evaporate in the morning mist. It demanded an ending, a final, deliberate punctuation mark. The affair had started in the moonlit quiet of the kitchen, and she felt a bizarre, self-destructive compulsion to give it a proper burial in the darkness of its final night. She waited until the house was completely still, until the only sound was the distant call of a loon across the water. Her heart was a slow, heavy drum in her chest as she left her room and walked down the hallway to his. The door to the master suite was slightly ajar. This was his and Eleanor's space, the inner sanctum. Stepping through that door would be the ultimate final trespass. Her hand trembled as she pushed it open. He was in bed, propped up against the pillows, reading a book under a single low-wattage lamp. He looked up when she entered, his expression not of surprise, but of a quiet, weary expectation, as if he knew she would eventually come. He didn't speak. He simply watched her as she crossed the room, the thick carpet muffling her footsteps. She stopped at the foot of the bed, a silent supplicant. The air in the room was thick with the faint floral scent of Eleanor's perfume, a ghostly presence that made Clara's throat tighten. He closed his book, placing it on the nightstand, and held back the covers on the empty side of the bed. It was a silent invitation. She hesitated for only a second before moving around the bed and slipping under the sheets. The fabric was cool and smelled of him, of clean laundry, and of her sister. He turned off the lamp, plunging the room into a deep, velvety darkness, broken only by the pale rectangle of the window. He turned to her then, and in the gloom, they came together. There were no passionate, hungry kisses, no whispered words of desire. This was something else entirely. It was a slow, melancholic, and deeply sad coupling. His hands moved over her body with a heavy, familiar languor, not with the fire of possession, but with the weight of a final, sorrowful inventory. Her own arms wrapped around his neck, her fingers clinging to the solid reality of his shoulders, holding on as if he were the only thing keeping her from drifting away into the darkness. This was not an act of passion. It was an act of mourning. Every slow, deliberate movement was a lament. Every shared, sighing breath was an elegy for the trust they had incinerated, for the people they had been before this summer began. They moved together in a silent, rhythmic grief. And as he was inside her, a single hot tear escaped from the corner of Clara's eye, tracing a silent path down her temple and into her hair. It was followed by another and another, until she was crying without sound, her body shaking with silent, racking sobs. She was not crying from pain or from pleasure. She was crying for the immense, irrevocable loss. She wept for her sister, for the pure, uncomplicated love she had destroyed. She wept for the beautiful, sun-drenched house that had become her prison. But most of all, she wept for the girl who had arrived here 3 weeks ago, a girl who was a little lost but still fundamentally whole, a girl who still believed in perfect love stories and the unbreakable bonds of family. That girl was gone. She had been murdered in this very house, and Clara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she could never bring her back. He must have felt her tears, the tremors of her silent grief, but he said nothing. He simply held her tighter, his rhythm unchanging, his own purpose unreadable in the dark. It was a shared, desperate act of oblivion, a final, futile attempt to erase the past and the future, to exist for one last moment only in the flesh. When it was over, a profound emptiness descended on the room. There was no intimacy in the aftermath, no shared glance or tender touch. There was only the sound of their breathing in the dark and the immense weight of what they had done. She slipped out of his bed without a word, her body feeling used and hollowed out. She did not look back as she padded silently out of the room, closing the door softly behind her, leaving him alone in the darkness that smelled of his wife. Back in her own room, she didn't bother trying to sleep. She simply sat on her packed suitcase by the window, watching the moonlit water, and waited for the dawn. The affair was over. It hadn't ended with a bang or a fight or a tearful confession. It had simply expired, a final, sad breath in the dark. And Clara finally understood the true cost of her summer at the lake house. It wasn't just a betrayal of her sister, it was a betrayal of herself. She had traded her own soul for a handful of beautiful, poisonous moments, and it was a debt she would spend the rest of her life trying to repay. The dawn was a reluctant smear of gray on the horizon when Clara finally moved. In the pre-dawn stillness, every sound was magnified, the whisper of her clothes as she dressed, the soft, near-silent click of her suitcase latches. She moved through the house like a phantom, her bare feet making no sound on the polished floors. She didn't allow herself a final, sentimental look. To look back was to risk feeling something, and all she wanted was the clean, cold emptiness of escape. Yet, as she passed the kitchen, her eyes were drawn against her will to the granite island, its surface gleaming innocently in the faint light. A crime scene. The whole house was a crime scene, and she was the only one who knew it. She didn't leave a note. What could she possibly write? Words were inadequate for the scope of her betrayal. They were the tools of lies, and she was done with them. Her car started with a roar that seemed to tear the silence of the morning in two. She half expected Daniel to appear at a window, but the house remained dark, sleeping, indifferent. She put the car in drive and didn't look back until she was at the end of the long gravel road. In the rearview mirror, the magnificent house of cedar and glass stood against the rising mist, looking like a perfect, beautiful dream. Then, as she turned onto the main road, it was swallowed by the trees and was gone. The road ahead was shrouded in a thick, wet fog, and for the first time in weeks, Clara felt nothing at all. Autumn bled into the brittle cold of winter. Clara had found a small, anonymous apartment in a city far away, and a quiet job in a bookstore that allowed her to disappear among the shelves. She spoke to her sister on the phone once a week, her voice a carefully constructed imitation of her old self, her words chosen with the precision of a bomb disposal expert. Each conversation was a minefield. Every "we" from Eleanor, "we went hiking, we're thinking of redecorating," was a small explosion in Clara's ear. Then came Thanksgiving. It was an inescapable family command performance. To refuse would be to raise 1,000 questions she could never answer. The gathering was at her aunt's house, a warm, noisy chaos of relatives, the smell of roasting turkey, and the sound of laughter. For a few hours, surrounded by the familiar faces of her childhood, Clara almost felt normal. Then they arrived. Eleanor and Daniel walked in, and the energy in the room seemed to shift, to focus on them. They were radiant, a matched set of success and beauty. Eleanor was laughing, her cheeks flushed from the cold. Daniel, ever the perfect husband, was right beside her, his arm resting lightly on her back. He scanned the crowded room and his eyes met Clara's. In that instant, the bottom dropped out of her world. There was no flicker of a shared secret, no shadow of the humid boathouse or the moonlit kitchen. There was nothing. Just a brief, cool, and utterly polite nod of recognition before his gaze moved on. It was the look one gives a distant cousin or a former coworker. It was the look of a stranger. He had erased her. He had sealed that chapter, locked the door, and walked away without a scratch, leaving her trapped inside. Later, Eleanor cornered her by the fireplace, pulling her into a tight, warm hug. "I've missed you so much," she said, her voice genuine and full of love. "You look so thin, honey. Are you eating?" City life must be exhausting. She squeezed Clara's arms, her brow furrowed with sisterly concern. "We have the most amazing news," she gushed, her eyes sparkling as she glanced back at Daniel, who was now charming a circle of their elderly relatives. "Daniel just got a huge promotion. We're going to build an extension on the lake house next spring. A proper guest wing. You'll have to come stay for the whole summer." The words were a physical blow. Clara could only stare at her sister's happy, innocent face, a smile frozen on her own lips, her heart turning to a block of ice in her chest. The noise of the party, the clinking glasses, the rising crescendo of family gossip, the football game on the television, all of it faded into a dull, distant roar. She was standing in a room full of people who had known her entire life, yet she had never felt so profoundly and completely alone. The secret she carried was no longer just a memory, it was a physical presence. A silent, ghostly figure standing between her and her sister. It was there in Eleanor's loving hug, a cold barrier that prevented any real warmth from reaching her. She looked across the room at Daniel, who caught her eye again for a fleeting second. This time, there was a flicker of something in his expression, a warning, a cold and final command to maintain the perfect facade he had so effortlessly reassumed. She watched as Eleanor walked back to him, placing a loving, trusting hand on his arm, smiling up at him with an adoration that was painful to witness. And as Clara stood there, an island of silence in a sea of celebration, the final, haunting question began to form, a question that she knew would follow her for the rest of her days. Was this silence her final, twisted act of love for her sister, protecting her from a truth that would shatter her world? Or was it the ultimate act of cowardice, a selfish preservation of her own fragile peace, allowing her sister to live a beautiful, perfect lie? There was no answer. There would never be an answer. There was only the sound of her sister's happy laughter and the vast, silent, and unending emptiness in her own heart.